Okay, we're gonna start. Yes, okay. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce and welcome Felicity Scott today at our college. Felicity is an incredible scholar, historian, and theoretician. She is a professor of architecture and the director of a PhD program in architecture, history, and theory, and coordinator of the program in critical, curatorial, and conceptual practices in architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Felicity has a prolific body of work, and she has published extensively. We all have read her book, Architecture or Techno-Utopia, Politics After Modernism, which was published by MIT University Press in 2007. She has also published Ant Farm with Akhtar in 2008, and her most recent book, Outlaw Territories, Environments of Insecurity, Architecture of Counter-Insurgency by Zone Books in 2016. And another recent book on the Austrian immigrant architect Bernard Rudowski, which is called Disorientations, Bernard Rudowski in the Empire of Science, published by Stromberg Press in 2016. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Felicity Scott.
Thank you so much, Terne, and also for the kind invitation to speak here tonight, and through that for the opportunity to see so many great papers today, which has been a real pleasure. And I also wanted to acknowledge the importance of your marking the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Ohio National Guard's violence against the anti-war protesters, which, this was remarked upon earlier, remains such a landmark in so many histories of this period, and so important to contend with. What I'm actually going to present today takes place, we might say, in the wake of that event, and also of the U.S. entry into Cambodia. And it's not actually a story of radicalization, even, or in my mind anyway, even if it is often portrayed that way, but of something like the capture and redirection of the energy of the anti-war protests under claims to sponsoring participation and the launching of alternative lifestyles. And so while it might have seemed maybe more relevant for me to present work closer to outlaw territories, I'm going to make a slightly lateral move here and pay some attention to some of the nuances of the responses to this type of activism or protests, and to think through aspects of its disposition. And I'll say a number of the images that you'll see, these grainy video images, are from video by Optiknov. That was one of the entry points in archives, visual archives, for this research. And the other thing I wanted to say in advance is the motivation also for returning to this material does come out of the sort of end of the work in outlaw territories, where I'm still struggling with the political ambivalence of the work and legacies of Stuart Brand. So Brand here too is subject to some type of critique. Anyway, so we're actually going to begin in Manchester, in England. In September 1971, British critic Raider Banham presented a paper entitled, as you see, Alternative Networks for the Alternative Culture, ? At a Design Research Society conference. Rightly speculating on the normalization of the concept of design participation, to which the conference was dedicated, Banham traced a rapid shift from what he called the shockwaves launched by Julian Beinart in 1965 to an equally shocking co-optation of the term participation, recently presented at the Architectural Association. So Beinart had presented the transformation of Western Native Township on the outskirts of Johannesburg, a segregated township planned by South Africa's apartheid regime, he was celebrating the inhabitants' creative practice of taking control of their environment through the addition of murals, gardens, etc., and of course, a highly constrained instance of participation here, even if that's not Banham's point. Only 6 years later, 2 delegates at Alvin Boyarsky's 1971 summer session audience celebrated the role of landowners and development companies in their scheme under the rhetoric of participation. So reading the Manchester Conference as evidence, nevertheless, of an ongoing appeal, Banham queried, and I quote, "Why do we want the people, that convenient abstraction, to participate in the process of design?" So to him, this turn to the people signaled a crisis in professionalism and specialized expertise, a crisis born of the recognition among designers that their practices were out of sync with the broader populace. So alternative cultures, he posited, would offer lessons for bridging this gap. So Banham was not simply appealing to populism here, but questioning radical political claims. He reminded his audience that Marxists had dismissed the contemporary underground as hardly alternative, since they had accepted what he called some of the capitalists' rules of the game. Many indeed had made great entrepreneurs, like Stuart Brand, and they were not against profiting from alternative music festivals and the like. So you see Brand here on the left at the Stockholm conference. I'll come back to this image. So for Banham, this was exactly why alternative culture, both terms capitalized, offered an alternative. In refusing what he saw as a 150-year-old polarization containing elements both of capitalism and of Marxism, he argued they had marked out a third way, which for him was a positive term. So Banham cautioned that he was not speaking of any type of dialectical sublation of capitalism and Marxist critique, but of an alternative, a point to which I'll come back in concluding. He then abruptly shifted focus to technology, identifying the site of a similarly diffused polarization. If conventional oppositions had situated, as he put it, technologies on the one hand and beautiful neo-Luddites on the other, this had all changed when you read the Whole Earth Catalog, which you see here, wherein you discovered that there are some beautiful people who can use technology, end of quote. In Mexico, he goes on, they are soaring the roofs of cars to make domes and things. They're making beautiful sculptures out of abandoned driving mirrors. And he went on, pointing, it seems, to Drop City, which is actually in Colorado, not in New Mexico. So in contrast, then, to those who divided technology into good and bad camps, Banham recognized here a more relaxed in his language, but also, as he reiterated, a more unpolarized attitude. And what it was all about, really, he went on, is that there are no rules to their game. So when technology was put in the hands of the people, he concluded in a laudatory tone, the people would invent their own rules for the game, and hence, do-it-yourself is the only real design participation. It's what the Whole Earth Catalog is about, where to find the resources to do what you want to do with your own set of rules. And so you might not have picked it here, but he's making this subtle shift from a situation of no rules for a situation of inventing them or reinventing them. So I begin with Banham here as an entry point for reading the ambiguity at play in this do-it-yourself, alternative identified, high-tech practice of the early 1970s, in part for a foothold within architectural history and for the connections to two icons of the 1960s counterculture, Drop City and the Whole Earth Catalog. That the British critic would allude to these landmarks from across the Atlantic seems far from incidental. With characteristic insight and ambiguous political valence, Banham recognized that the Whole Earth Catalog, famously launched by Stuart Brand in fall of 1968 under the rubric of access to tools, had served as a vehicle to subtly refute or undermine the political radicalism of the New Left, including the anti-war protest movements, that the catalog was not seeking to overcome a polarized opposition to capitalism or militarism in the name of a different claim to social and economic justice, or as another strategy of defying the logics of capitalist development, but to recall Banham's terms, to rescript the rules of the game. Indeed, far from anti-capitalist, Brand had sought to capture and re-articulate emergent techniques of power that might serve capital's next phase. Do-it-yourself practices, as Banham rightly observed, proved an important vehicle for new forms of subjective training, often resituating the subject and her mode of agency as a testing ground within and for an expanding and transforming apparatus of power. So who then, I want to ask, was rescripting the rules of the game? In whose interest were they hoping to do so? And of course, to what ends? So if Banham identified Drop City and the Whole Earth Catalog as elements of an alternative culture, he nowhere clarified what he meant by alternative networks, as it appeared in his title. But we might recall here, as Fred Turner has argued, that Brand's legacy and that of the Whole Earth ideology lies less in the catalog itself than in the network forums he forged, particularly between the California counterculture and the Bay Area computer scene. 4 months before Banham's presentation in Manchester, Brand had loudly announced the catalog's end, staging a spectacular demise party in the Exploratorium of San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts. Attended by 1,500 people affiliated with the Whole Earth Initiative, this was a theatrical extravaganza replete with belly dancers, trampoline artists, clowns, and music. During the party, Brand delivered $20,000 in cash into the hands of the revelers, challenging them to come to a consensus about how to use this new tool, in this case, money. So hoping to foster an entrepreneurial sort of mandate, and entrepreneurial relations between the counterculture, computer technology, and capital, and to suspend political disagreements in favor of consensus, he announced, "We are into frontier territory now." So he's mobilizing this language of frontiers that he had deployed all along in his celebration of the Back to the Land movement only a few years earlier. So in the wake of this event, Brand then focused on instituting further connections between the California counterculture and what he cast as a similarly vanguardist ethos within the Bay Area computer scene, publishing what you see here, Space War, Fanatic Life, and Symbolic Death among the computer bums in a 1972 issue of Rolling Stone magazine. Embracing military, academic, and corporate research institutes like the Stanford Research Institute's Human Augmentation Research Center, Xerox PARC, ARPA, the research branch of the US military, he identified them as the new frontier, replete with a new vanguard, that of hackers, whose outlaw ethos, he posited, had updated the now tired experimental ethos of the counterculture and the protest movement. Steve Beyer, with whom Brand had earlier collaborated to bring people from the technological and long-haired worlds together, as he put it, at Paradigm, was now cast simply as the neo-Luddite heralding from dusty Albuquerque on account of questioning the ethos of Xerox PARC. So Banham, and again I'll come back to Banham in concluding, was not wrong to question simple oppositions between good and bad technology, to which we might add good or bad money, for the uses to which these might be put remain ambiguous. But this ambiguity does not render them neutral elements for scripting a third way, or is somehow beyond politics. I would want to argue it's quite the opposite. It suggests the importance of attending to the apparatus within which they circulate, to unpack the political tendencies at work in how they are put to use, particularly by those seeking to rescript the rules of the game. So it's with this in mind that I want to turn to Brand's Space Wars, particularly to his concluding remarks on Resource One, an alternative computer resource center founded in 1970. Disillusioned by the US invasion of Cambodia, or so the story goes, a group of young computer programmers, including Pam Hart, who you see on the bottom here, was spurred to talk, and I quote, about how it was actually possible to do something positive with technology when you defined the goals, initially creating a database of Berkeley activists, then responding to a call to participate in the forming of an urban commune within an obsolescent industrial building in San Francisco. Fred Turner has detailed the importance of Resource One, which is the Alternative Computer Center, to the history of the now ubiquitous personal computing phenomena, recalling its relations to Lee Felsenstein, the Homebrew Computing Club, the People's Computer Center, and a whole series of other landmarks from the Bay Area, that Bay Area story. So here, I want to ask how this story might relate to the alternative networks and the cultural and spatial imaginaries attending the do-it-yourself rehabilitation of the space or the building in which Resource One operated, which is Project One. So breaking from the catalog's association with rural communes and the back to the land ethos to which many hippies had subscribed, but channeling the rhetoric of access to tools, of pioneers, of frontiers, and of the production of new selves and new communities, this story takes place in San Francisco's South of Market District, now home to major software and internet companies, Uber, these sorts of places. So the search then for cheap land in the country to colonize, or to recolonize, we might say, was here redirected to appropriating obsolescent industrial spaces in the city as the American economy transformed. Indeed, I want to suggest these urban communades participated at or near the very forefront of a US-led transformation as communications technologies, a knowledge economy, and post-industrial labor increasingly came to reconfigure social, economic, and urban relations in America, including collapsing living and workspaces and forging new topologies born of remote access. So Brand introduced Resource One under the subtitle Counter Computer, marking connections to the Whole Earth Initiative via the rhetoric of access to tools and alternative lifestyles, and recalling that the early funding came from the network forged during his demise party. In a sly move and marking a distance from what he called classic dropout culture, he transitioned to personal computing by citing Peter Deutsch, a veteran of the ARPA-funded Project Mac, and then a researcher at Xerox PARC. Stressing a desire for the expansion of computers into society at large, Deutsch had announced, computers, they'll reach millions when computer power becomes like telephone power. I think it's important to bring computing power to the people. So if we add Alan Kay, Dave Evans, Ivan Sutherland, of course, Sketchpad fame, all cited by Stuart Brand in this text, we find key figures that were scripting the new rules of the game. So computers have since, of course, become part of a dominant communications infrastructure. Their networks extending globally. Like telephones, their capillary reach has become entirely normalized. So Brand's Space Wars, it's important though to stress, was not trying to popularize computer gaming, which is the ostensible subject of the article, but to collapse semantic distinctions between those at the forefront of the military-industrial complex and those who seemed, at least initially, to have dropped out of that very same system or to be in some way refusing it. Recognizing a perfect opportunity for the counterculture to serve as a research and development arm for the military-industrial complex, Brand concluded, and I quote, "In what direction the computer use at Resource One evolves should be of interest. If I were a computer manufacturer, I'd pay the closest attention and maybe donate some goodies." So computing power to the people, indeed, I want to suggest. And again, I'll come back to Resource One, but I first want to actually introduce this urban commune. So founded in June 1970, Project One occupied a 5-story, 84,000 square feet industrial building on Howard Street. Built in the 1920s as a candy factory, and with columns on 17-foot centers, it had lay vacant for decades. In mid-April 1970, 2 bearded, long-haired architects met with a successful trials lawyer to consummate a real estate deal, as resident Craig Mosher recalled in his 1971 account, Creating One, an operating manual for CityShip One, a new urban community, and he's playing, of course, on Buckminster Fuller's operating manual for Spaceship Earth. So key here was Ralph Scott, no relation, a San Francisco-based architect and Haight-Ashbury veteran who had trained at Cornell, Harvard, and MIT. He designed, as he put it, a geodesic dome for radar stations in Japan, as well as working on subway stations in San Francisco, before quitting his job during the Summer of Love under the belief that his integrity was being tampered with, by working in the commercial world. So at Project One, Scott ran ECOS, dedicated to expanding the initiative into a warehouse community ecosystem. The building was quickly converted into approximately 60 studios, or as they referred to them as spaces. In addition to Resource One and ECOS, the groups and services at Project One in its early years included the video collective Optic Nerve, filmmakers called Imageworks, an experimental high school, a health co-op staffed by doctors, masseurs, chiropractors, and herbalists, an alpha brainwave researcher, a holography school reputedly attended by Salvador Dali, the San Francisco Vietnam Veterans Against the War Resisters League, a recording studio, craft collectives, construction collectives, the Ecology Center Press, a women's karate academy, architects, artists, musicians, and more. So in resident Charles Reisch's 1976 retrospective account, Pueblo in the City, which was published in Mother Jones, and it's one of its very first issues, Project One appears as an urban recapitulation of the Back to the Land commune story, wherein the ad hoc strategy and communal drive of building an architecture for common together initially created an environment for social and aesthetic experimentation, but soon congealed into a normative ethos and living situation. People continue to flow into one, immigrants to a new community, or refugees from an older one, he wrote, channeling the pioneering, even frontier, imaginary so pervasive within the counterculture, and of course, so problematic. So, hence once again, we find a narrative of open space available for occupation that mirrors the language of manifest destiny and settler colonialism. The first day people pitched tents and parachutes and started building rooms with sheetrock walls, he recalled, referring in turn to the vast spatial expanse as a cavernous yawn of concrete expanding into the distance, the floors and ceiling seeming to meet back there in the shadows, empty. This, of course, the idea of a land being empty was precisely one of the key rubrics under which settler colonial occupation of this country took place. So Reisch described the intense energy then that went into building Project One day and night, with intermittent breaks for frenzied drinking and other scenes of bacchanalia. Soon after, he noted that Paul Wides, who had studied with Paolo Soleri, showed up, moved in, and began designing and building sculpted, soft, concrete environments. And I quote here, "The inside of one is painted like a clockwork orange set, with endless orange, blue, crimson, rainbow, splash-colored hallways and stairwells." Sorry, I don't have any colored images. There's more than a mile of psychedelically colored walkways. There are flowing sculptured walls that weave in and out, whole cement sculptured apartments, and multifunctional group baths and showers with tile work and glass windows, cut glass windows. There's a 20-foot wide Nautilus spa in which you can luxuriate. There are counterbalanced walls that swing out, revealing an entry into an apartment complex at the touch of a finger, end quote. So we've once a seemingly endless space available for appropriation and settlement. By 1976, he lamented, there are no longer vast empty spaces to conquer with sheetrock walls. The fervor has gradually wheezed out. Once a homestead, America's largest urban commune is today rapidly evolving into a dormitory. Social unrest is at rest. At one, it's like the 1950s all over again. So if Reisch spoke, at least initially, to long hairs, freaks, hippies, frontiers, and do-it-yourself practices, along with tents, surplus parachutes, the picture was complicated by the commune's unprecedented access to a new generation of tools, computers. Although Reisch channeled the whole earth rhetoric, recalling that tools were scammed, demystified, and made free to anyone who wanted access to them, Project One was, as he put it, a high technology pueblo right in the middle of San Francisco. Raish opened his account with the crazy scene of former Berkeley computer programmer Pam Hart, who we've seen a couple of times, we see her again, convincing the Trans-America Corporation to donate an SDS 940 to Resource One. Radicalized to recall by the US invasion of Cambodia, she and a group of colleagues, or so the story goes, designed and retrieved a program for coordinating all of the actions on campus, spurring them to talk and think about how it was actually possible to do something positive with technology. So after responding to Scott's call to found a new commune, and soon armed with the SDS 940 and an operating system donated by Xerox PARC, they expanded their project to designing a retrieval system and establishing a communal database to coordinate the entire Bay Area alternative community, a system modeled after a community switchboard referral system. The ambition, Hart stressed to Optic Nerve, was to make technology accessible to people who normally don't have access to technology, to help them understand what computers could do. The SDS 940's timeshare capacity, she added, meant that people from other places in the city can have access to this computer here at Project One without having to come down here, end of quote. So Raish did not mention that Xerox PARC supplied the operating system, the XDS 940, nor that Deutsch and his colleagues, along with others from the Berkeley Computer Corporation, had helped to set it up. Indeed, the fact that Hart was surrounded by long-haired, unshaven, dropout computer freaks, as she put it, while she quite remarkably convinced a major US corporation to donate a $300,000 piece of equipment, was cast as a mark of countercultural authenticity, and Raish mused over the fact that those installing the beast had to step over the detritus of the lifestyle of bacchanalia. Moreover, the technology remained cast as something of an alien within the commune. In Raish's account, and I quote, "When the computer finally arrives, it's big and whirring, like an outer space tractor trailer with beeps, lights, and everything but Mr. Spock's pointed ears mirrored in its shiny knobs. Installed within a dustless, airtight space, the physical separation manifests not a spatial divide, but a distinct spatial topology." I quote again here, "Joints float around outside the glass walls. There she whirls, it's ours. Holy technological revolutionaries, political power comes out of the barrel of a rolled-up computer printout. It's ours." You know, this rhetoric, again, of the people. So Raish mused over their situation, and then he was learning at once to use a diamond gun to affix 2x4s to the concrete walls, to produce studs to enable the space's physical transformation, and to use the computer language, Rogears, which is the software, the system that soon after would feed Felsenstein's community memory project, an initiative seeking to integrate an area-wide alternative community into a centralized database through their participation. And I'll come back to why I find this so troubling. After detailing the transformation of the warehouse and its outreach via computer, Raish noted its effect on the internal village, and I quote, "Symbolically, the computer formed the core of the Project One community. The SDS 940 became a free access community computer for Northern California. Project One's computer freaks now use it to do typesetting, research, mailing, and bookkeeping for Amnesty International, or the Tenants Action League, or statewide Chicano organizations, and many other groups. 4 years ago, when it came to One, the computer set the tone for the type of people who would now be admitted. No lazy hippies allowed, no welfare types, no people who just wanted to stay stoned all the time, no students looking for a dormitory, no artists or theater people or wackies in any form anymore, unless they were really into building a community and could prove it to the general meeting," end of quote. So it was a space where an experimentation to demarcate membership and institute governing structures through which to manage the internal community, determining who could participate, had operated then in close proximity to an emerging topology of non-contiguous access to the world outside. So that this warehouse, like others in the district, was empty is not incidental to my story. shifting labor patterns, both nationally and globally, associated with the post-war service economy, had rendered first world urban industry largely a thing of the past, and such former industrial neighborhoods were by this time full of obsolescent infrastructure and were populated largely by precarious minority and poor or working class groups. South of Market had long been home to African American, Filipino, Chicano, Native American, and Catholic communities, and would soon become known for nightclubs and an active queer culture. Speaking of the neighborhood's transition from heavy industry to light service, Raish noted, and I quote, "Capitalism can no longer afford organized urban factory labor. Plants have been moved to suburban industrial parks, rural areas, or third world countries where labor can be purchased more cheaply." Not something that he was at all troubled by here. So residents at Project One were, by contrast, largely from an educated middle class who, despite such access to socioeconomic advantage, imagined themselves too to face a similar threat of obsolescence. Most One people grew up in the Cold War and the Great Space Race and were schooled through the 60s to be an educated labor class, Raish explained, and they were, of course, largely white as well. They were to fit into growing industries related to software, research and development and communications. But as a One flyer put it, we were fooled in the same way the Okies were lured to California by the growers. 5 jobs were promised when there was only one available. I'm sure you know, Okies, farmers who found themselves largely out of agricultural work in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So Project One served then less as a space to pursue a liberated life than as a way station or an arena in which to develop new methods of survival, even a form of life to compensate for the threat of redundancy within a post-industrial economy. This, at least, was a very American story. If residents had, in some sense, dropped out of the mainstream, many, in fact, never identified as hippies or radicals, and those so-called Haight-Ashbury veterans often refused ongoing political activism. As noted in Where Have All the Flower Children Gone to Communes, instead of references to Angela Davis, Che Guevara, or women's liberation, the journalist noted, one now found a search for personal change, higher consciousness, and the quality of family life. So the general attitude of Haight-Ashbury veterans, the author summarized, is that America is to be loved and has a bright future. So the article ended on Ralph Scott, 35, the architect who had initiated the urban warehouse movement to house countercultural activities. Project One, the writer rightly noted, was a straighter kind of hip. So Raish predicted that unlike their minority neighbors, most Oneers would end up reintegrated within wealthy, normative, largely white, middle-class environments. Project One served then as an apparatus for those seeking an alternative way to enter back into the money economy, now armed with a new set of skills. So it was in this sense that Raish proposed that the building, too, was a tool. Project One was conceived as a do-it-yourself technology, a type of prosthetic device through which, in creating new transformable environments, residents might help to create new selves, new community structures, new lifestyles, new forms of expertise. They could slough off received forms of sociality, of work, and of subjective and bodily regulation, and integrate new techniques during a moment of transition. If the industrial worker is conceived as the complement of the tool in the factory, their subjectivity and bodily techniques produced in part through this nexus. Something similar was at play here for the post-industrial worker of the 1970s, as they navigated the vicissitudes of an environment still marked by the very material conditions and structures of power that seemed newly obsolescent. We have to learn how to live, one communard explained to Optic Nerve as they filmed the communards, casting the building as a learning tool or as an educational apparatus. Or in Moshe's words, and I quote, "We seek to gain control over our own lives by creating a physical and organizational environment which facilitates the cooperative, integrated lifestyle we are developing. We utilize the cost of resources of the industrial economy everything from used lumber to a computer to our own skills. We seek to integrate the living parts of our lives by living where we work. We learn and share new skills with each other, including carpentry, computer programming, ceramics, guitar playing, and drain unplugging. So in the very few accounts of the commune that exist, we find this repeated appeal to the nexus of subjective training or retraining, a highly material do-it-yourself retrofitting of the environment, communication infrastructures, and new forms of community or lifestyle, all coming together as a de- and reconditioning mechanism geared toward rescripting the rules of the game. So haunting this experimentation with environments, subjectivities, communities, and lifestyle lay the question of establishing new forms of regulation and of governance. And in Project One, this is the video documentary that I've been drawing images from, by Optic Nerve, residents being filmed repeatedly stress that occupying the building was about trying to gain more control over their lives, and doing so in a way that was not subject to the whims of politicians and power brokers. They mobilized the language of self-determination as though seeking liberation from oppressive rule, social, architectural, and legal, in describing their reoccupation of industrial space. Moshe even referred to the commune as moving towards a redefinition of government that may even be laying the foundations of a new society. Noting, however, that power tripping remained a problem in continual struggle as the communards worked to fill the void left by normative social and economic structures and regulatory codes within Project One. So residents questioned whether or not to retain something of an anarchistic state or to construct new rules and decision-making protocols for the governance of their community to come, as related to things like space, money, property, admittance, etc. And of course, they proliferated lots and lots of new rules. Stressing the imminent or evolutionary nature of their community, of the community structure at Project One, Moshe insisted that rules were not planned, but emerged from our ongoing activities. However, with the lack of hygiene facilitating the spread of disease and the failure of many to pay rent or participate in maintenance, rules for the participation and new social norms quickly emerged to temper the chaos. And so here again, we see the switch, as Banham suggested, from no rules to something like the invention of new rules, and through them, a new series of habits. So that Project One was, in the first instance, something of a laboratory or demarcated testing ground for a semi-autonomous form of life, and with it new relations between life and work was evident in its apparently inward focus. Under the title Human Ecology, Beth Roy reported that the fusion of home and work was a key ambition, and they talk about a number of people feeling like they never left the commune. Within rural communes, too, as amenities familiar to modern industrial life had been discarded in favor of doing it yourself. Specialized work like agriculture, shelter production, education, making clothes, baking bread had become, once again, a large part of everyday life. So many Project One residents remarked on not ever having to leave or realize that they hadn't left the building for days. Yet this isolation soon raised the question of how they would reconnect to the outside world, how they would forge alternative openings to this type of outside. Moshe described a situation in which the communards actively cultivated connections, including with people who have political influence in the city and state. If on the one hand, this was a necessity, since living in an industrial building in a communal manner was actually technically illegal at this time, it was a type of outlaw area. On the other hand, they sought not just to legalize, but literally to expand their practices of occupying industrial spaces through implementing new policies. In fact, he explained, we hope to create an entirely new category in the zoning law, which allows communities to use space for living and working at the same time. So these repeated calls then for gaining more control over our lives deployed the language of tools, choice, and change, but also of regulation, speaking also to a deprofessionalization that paralleled Rayner Banham's musings on DIY culture with which we began. Constructing the environment was no longer the domain of professional expertise as provided by an architect or building norm, but simply a matter of access to tools, and with it subjective choice that somehow opened onto a process of transformation. We are dimly groping towards awareness of transformation, change, process as the reality of our lives, Motion noted, as if recognizing, as Paulo Virno and other philosophers would later understand, that a post-Fordist economy required subjective and cognitive adaptability of its knowledge workers, the habit of having no habits. In Moshe's words, a state of constant change is becoming an energizing reality rather than a frightening consequence of our actions. Transition has become a way of life if we can only recognize it and accept it. And so I want to come back here briefly to this political valence of technologies at play here and to the rhetoric of tools or of access to tools, which marks such a key connection to Brand's Holoth catalog his ideology, and which remains central to Project One's ethos of sharing and of collaborating. Beth Roy had insisted that a key aim of Project One was to demystify the technological process, connecting this demystification to deprofessionalization. She writes, and I quote, "Resource One, the first people's computer, strives to do just that. According to the founder, Pam Hart, the goal is to eliminate the intervention of the professional programmer. Most of the work on the computer will be done by the people who use it," she says, "by human beings involved in communication instead of technicians serving a machine. Then the computer becomes a tool rather than a mysterious electronic giant." In retrospect, however, access to the SDS 940, far from facilitating a demystification regarding just what sort of tool the computer was, performed something closer to its obverse, including the obfuscation of the complex relation of Resource One to the expertise of figures from Xerox PARC, and of the manner in which one learned or assimilated its embedded communications protocol and mandates. Like the warehouse itself, they were not autonomous tools. They remained articulated within a more distributed and distinctly biopolitical apparatus. Information was not circulating freely, creating a politically empowering information community vision that undermined bureaucracies, as Turner has suggested. Information circulated within the emerging protocols of a regulatory system, access to an understanding of which was increasingly foreclosed. Information circulated, moreover, in a manner that served the system's information needs. So the technology became more available, seemingly so. The assemblage of power to which it opened onto did not necessarily become more transparent. And we might suggest that access to the SDS, and this was actually the first computer with a time-sharing capacity, or sort of infrastructure for time-sharing from different teletype terminals. The SDS presented here as a counter-practice appeared to disarticulate the computer from this distributed matrix. A society is defined by its amalgamations, not by its tools, Gilles Deleuze reminds us. Tools exist only in relation to the interminglings they make possible, or that make them possible. Tools and information provide sites of mediation between subjects and a dispositif of power. They situate, entrain, and enjoin subjects, including under the rubric of choice. Control was no longer tantamount to coercion, but to a less evident form of regulation, even to the fantasy of self-regulation. These were the new rules of the game. So I'm not suggesting that Project One did not seek to harbor a utopian vision, that it was somehow hopelessly cynical. Buoyed by the period's rhetoric of access to tools, a rhetoric motivated by powerful mythmakers like Stuart Brand, it's not surprising that countercultural engagements with computers were primarily identified with long-standing dreams that technological development would lead to a better and more just world, that social progress would emerge from a culture of expanded communication. My point is not that computers or information sharing are irredeemably problematic, or that we should dispense from them or disengage with them. Yeah? Rather, it's to underscore the need to understand with whom and how information is exchanged and to what ends. And so I just tie this back to Stockholm, and which is why I had images of Brand appearing here and there. So when Stuart Brand took a group of hippies to the Stockholm Conference, the UN Conference on the Environment, in 1972, the first thing he tried to do was to create a database of activists, and radical activists, and the European left. Only soon after. Did they find that he was in fact being funded through the Kaplan Foundation, which was an arm of the CIA. And so here, this collection of data, its centralization through Brand, needs to give us some pause. So it's evident today that access to tools and information do not simply drive processes of empowerment or liberation, even if sometimes that might come to pass. But nor does information flow necessarily lead to subjective assimilation within systems of control. Rather, tools and information situate subjects within complex apparatuses of cultural techniques, of knowledge and control, providing interfaces or forms of mediation between subjects and a dispositif of power. The question for a historian then is how to render that apparatus and its forces of governance legible, how to strategically position oneself within an ambivalent apparatus, and again, to what ends, how to actually radicalize something like information flow. So I just want to also suggest that I don't want to entirely subsume Brand to Project One, and I want to do it through this example. So it was not only money from the Whole Earth Demise Party that connected Resource One to Brand, but also Brand's Portola Institute, through which he distributed the vast profits from Whole Earth catalog sales, and also, of course, the long-standing attempt to integrate these people into network forums. Yet their ambitions, I want to say, were slightly out of sync, and I quote here. About the time of one's anniversary, Pam and I, and this is Moshe, went to a meeting at the Portola Institute to discuss the problem of creating a system for helping various alternative organizations communicate with each other. As the afternoon wore on, as the discussions bogged down in wrangling over whether there should be a central office or dispersed nodes of activity in the communication network. Had the people there felt any need to communicate with each other, they would have done it without needing to design an elaborate system for an entire Northern California area. Groups that have similar interests and needs do already meet and share information and ideas. Free schools and ecology groups hold meetings attended by people from all over the Bay Area. People in ECOS are establishing ties with some of the other warehouses in the city so that they can help each other with mutual problems. These linkages grow out of concrete felt needs and do not require any elaborate centralized system. End quote. So the desire for a more totalizing system, again, should give us pause. And before concluding, I want to briefly recall Resource One initiatives that Brand celebrated under the rubric of counter-computer in space war. Indeed, they speak precisely to the need to recognize that a society is defined by its tools, not by its tools, but by the interminglings they make possible. So Brand mentioned, firstly, the attempt to create a computerized retrieval system to extend the logic of the San Francisco switchboard. Not yet launched at the time of Brand's article, this led to the most ambitious project from Project One, from Resource One, the Community Memory Project, which used the STS 940's time-sharing capacity and ability to communicate through the telephone network to create an online system for the input and retrieval of information and sharing of databases. Related to this were, and I'm citing, healthcare statistical systems, wherein Resource One would offer services to digitize and collect databases from free clinics in San Francisco. We want to incorporate a system doing statistical work for the clinics, Pam Hart explained. Third, as Brand reported, was using government-generated tapes, like assessor tapes and census tapes, to begin analysis of the city. Such data collection was, of course, and remains, a hallmark of biopolitical forms of knowledge. Hart expanded on this data initiative when video interviewed by Optic Nerve, explaining that the plan was to take different subsystems, whether it be the political system, airflow through the city, the sewage system, and analyzing those systems and trying to come up with how we would design those systems if we have control over them, which fits into what ECOS is trying to do. So again, this imagined expansion from Project One to a system of refunctioned post-industrial spaces entailed expansion of biopolitical forms of governments, of data collection, of governance and control, and simultaneously the elimination of social and urban histories, and with it attention to injustice and political struggle. So hence raising the question of just how distinct this sort of alternative work with computers was from the systems of control sought by precedents such as MIT's Urban Systems Lab or the Architecture Machine Group during that same historical moment, or at least in the late 1960s. And this is a project where they're trying to extract information about their environment from these African-American housing activists in the South area of Boston. So access to tools and information, again, to underscore, and they thought they were talking to a computer, they were actually talking to white planners and white architects through the telephone line. So access to tools and information, to underscore my point one last time, are not tantamount to empowerment, but techniques of exposure, good or bad, to new forms of power at work within an ever more complex apparatus of control. The question here, to be clear, is not simply how to escape that apparatus and its biopolitical techniques, but how to capture and redirect them in the service of opening up new types of political space. And so I want to conclude by returning briefly to Optic-Nerve, the Video and Media Collective, and then to Rainer Banham. In Video City, a special issue of Radical Software, Optic-Nerve noted of their 1972 video, Project One, that we've been looking at, one prerequisite for the survival of any community is realization and control of those factors operating on it, in all cases, information. The video begins and ends with NASA astronauts walking on the moon, followed by footage from the US-led war in Vietnam, the Berkeley People's Park, and protests against the war. Then it pans across the raw warehouse spaces before offering a portrait of the occupants, events, and spaces of the commune. After Nixon had, as one communard noted, blown the shit out of Cambodia, this was a real alternative. So if landmark events of the era appear initially as the background against which the flower children rebelled from the normative lifestyle of America, hence driving the and also against actually the protest movement and aspects of the radical left, hence driving the narrative of their entry into the commune, a certain semantic ambiguity remains. This is not just a narrative of technology working in the service of the good, nor is it simply positioning the warehouse as a semi-utopian alternative free of a complex inscription within a larger apparatus of power. For Project One's participants, the warehouse served as a place to develop more flexible forms of life and of subjectivity. But it's as if the country's expansionist ethos, evident in planting the US flag on the moon and the Vietnam War, was less opposed than it was parallel to or mirrored in the occupation of the warehouse, speaking to the shift from an industrial to a post-industrial landscape and raising the question of how exactly it was alternative. So I think Banham helps us here, and I want to come back to his enigmatic title, Alternative Networks for the Alternative Culture, question mark. The question mark appears to signal a moment of doubt, a doubt directed not at alternative culture, which, to recall, he celebrated as overcoming the polarization of capitalist tendencies and Marxist critique, hence offering a third way that rewrote the rules of the game. We might read the question mark as putting into question alternative culture's relation to existing networks, whether in the sense of information infrastructure networks or networks of people and institutions that script cultural valence, such as the Whole Earth Catalog, to which he alluded. Moreover, when one looks a little closer, and perhaps Banham did, the overlap between the burgeoning techno-scientific and militarized apparatuses informing US-led forces of globalization and the libertarian ethos and ideals of open communication at work within the counterculture becomes increasingly evident, a connection desublimated the following year in Brand's Space War. So while I don't want to attribute too much agency to Brand, I do think his careful mentorship, his financial sponsorship, and his myth-making played an important role in this story, facilitating a depoliticization and the desired eradication of opposition or political dissensus, a move which is, of course, to underscore, still distinctly political. So the transformation at stake then was not only that of the industrial space occupied by Project One, a transformability achieved in part by its column grid and by the cheapness of sheetrock, but the presence also of the SDS 940, housed within a sealed, airtight space and communicating to the outside world through multiple distributed interfaces. Indeed, if the building was an apparatus for the production of new types of subjects or selves, they were to populate an emerging technological milieu and information-driven economy, and to participate within the updated forms of governance to which they gave rise. Those forces gave rise. The networks of information created by Resource One, in effect, modeled these new forms of life. Not unlike the residents of Western Native Township who had taken control of their environment, only to remind us in the negative of the constraints under which that type of creativity or participation actually operated. These networks were not, of course, housed behind the glass wall within Project One, but spread locally and globally, haunting the building in its obsolescence, while instituting conditions of possibility for emergent forms of life. Testing new forms of governance and self-regulation, both within their hermetic community and through its computer outreach, they experimented with how an individual and a system might now interrelate. They were doing so precisely at the moment when techniques of power were being increasingly reconfigured under the impact of computerization and the expansion of an information economy, facilitating ever more integrated, well dispersed, or even at times less visible forms of governance. Dreaming then the next phase of a liberal governing apparatus, then tending towards increasing degrees of apparent freedom, precisely as a mechanism of increasing an apparatus of control, these urban hippies indeed appear as something like vanguard subjects, those able to test this new assemblage, even to give it a visible face. And it's in this sense that they are recovered here as a historical symptom. And so with this in mind, I want to ask how we might distinguish two terms that are often conflated within the literature of the late 1960s and early 70s, that of counter and alternative. The practices and technologies I've been tracing here are better read not as countercultures, counterconducts, or even counter-computers, but as alternatives for testing how to live within new topologies of power. They remained unpolarized, to return to Banham's language, and this is not necessarily a good thing. Alternative refers to an act, person, lifestyle, or idea that is unconventional, non-traditional, sometimes even disjunctive or mutually exclusive, and this is certainly how they appeared in a first-order reading, hence Brand's very savvy mobilization of the valence of radicalism for hackers working for ARPA or Xerox PARC. But we're also faced with a more complex semantic playing field, wherein the valence of alternative tended towards its other meanings, that of simply another possibility, a choice, an option, something that could alternate like a switchboard or provide a bit of texture, as in alternative patterns and colors in a piece of fabric or textile. Tendencies now calibrated to function effectively within a culture of choice. To be counter implies more of an oppositional bent. A counterculture, countercomputer, or even counter-network should oppose. It should be in conflict with, operate against, even prevent. It should also insist, in so doing, on opening up a different kind of political space, on maintaining dissensus and not seeking consensus and integration. So despite its unusual appearance and mixture of high-tech and low-tech, Project One was not countering mainstream culture or a rising neoliberalism, but working to find a foothold to operate within capitalism differently. Likewise, Resource One's alternative guise rested on the belief that promoting information flow and network-based forms of collectivity was somehow inherently radical. Again, the question remains for whom and to what ends. So to recall an earlier point, Brand offered his answer in the closing words of Space Wars. recognizing a perfect opportunity for a countercultural group to serve as a research and development arm for the military-industrial complex, he had concluded in what direction the computer use at Resource One evolves should be of interest. If I were a computer manufacturer, I'd pay the closest attention and maybe donate some goodies. Computing power to the people, indeed. But there remains the possibility not only of working to reveal the apparatus of power within which communications technologies operate, but also of radicalizing information flows, of disturbing those flows, of opening up other political spaces. So those systems might, yes, in response, follow or co-opt such an opening, but in so doing they might also be prompted to shift their center of gravity or disposition, if only slightly, to more democratic ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicity. Such a fascinating lecture. Thank you, and great presentation. I'm going to open it to the audience for questions, and then if there was time, I'm going to ask my own questions.
Thanks for that, Felicity.
Thanks, Phil.
Very rich. I'm still thinking about it. I'm not sure it's exact question, but maybe I want to say a few things and tell me if I'm missing the point completely, right?
Okay, yeah.
Because, I mean, at the center of how you closed it is a question of cooptation. How something that seems like something becomes something else, something that seems like counter becomes something less.
Yeah.
And, you know, we see that all the time. When you were talking about that Project One, which I wondered, when did it end more or less? When were the last days of
You know,
it?
by 1974 or 5,
Right.
it was already, you know, like any sort of loft situation of normative families, and but by 1970, I mean, it still exists, but it's no longer a sort of urban commune. It's like an apartment building. Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, of course, communes, squats in warehouses existed before 1970.
Yeah.
But there is something special about the connection to work here.
Yes,
And
to
you know,
work,
and
yeah.
the way you describe it, I really see the kind of contemporary enclaves of creative industries.
Yes.
And, you know, even WeWork, perhaps,
Yes,
right?
yes,
And that-
yes.
you know,
Well, they're all
that's what-
located in exactly that neighborhood now. Yeah.
And I had to think also regarding the question of cooptation, of kind of history of squatting in Amsterdam. We have also the anti-squatters, anti-krakkers, which have been used to prevent squatting, but have a very similar lifestyle.
Yeah.
So look similar, but actually on a legal basis, completely something different.
Yes. Yes.
And then, of course, you had the breeding grounds policy since 1999.
I don't know what that is. Yeah.
It started off in Amsterdam as a way of legalizing squats.
Okay.
They don't say it. They can't say it because
yeah.
it's through tenders.
Yeah.
But effectively, every time a squat won the tender, and it was legalized. And now it's become a kind of policy they've been exporting to as if like a creative hub. And you can go and see some developments, I don't know if you've been in the last years, which look like squats, but they're totally designed. It's quite interesting. So the aesthetic is there, but
Yeah.
actually the illegality isn't there, of course, so the challenge isn't there. And I'm not even sure that the lifestyle is really there, right?
Yeah.
It's just a kind of vague suggestion. So again, not exactly a question, but just some of the thoughts I had while listening to you.
Well, two things. I mean, obviously, I'm not obviously, maybe, but you know, as a historian, I'm returning to this material and this nexus to think about a sort of moment in a lot of contemporary new media narratives, and of course, Brand has participated all the way through from the late 60s through Wired magazine in the 90s. You know, of course, he runs the Global Business Network now, so it's increasingly difficult to imagine that he's some type of, you know, radical, and he never claimed that himself. But that myth of digital cultures, somehow being avant-garde, even if they're really more something like a vanguard, persists. So to ask, you know, how that emerged is part of my project, but also it is to put, you know, pressure on those prehistories. But to come back to where you began around the cooptation, this is something, you know, what I'm trying to say here, and I haven't got this entirely theorized, is something like, you know, the alternative is, I mean, the option, of course, is not, as I said, imagining that one could find a space outside these systems or apparatuses, not returning to a sort of earlier, you know, critical model, sort of Frankfurt School model of thinking about how to relate, as though one could retreat to the Great Hotel Abyss and imagine that one's fingers were, somehow unsullied by this type of thing. And so what I'm suggesting is that, and if we think about something like the women's liberation movement or other, sort of activists' agendas of this period, even if, according to many narratives, they failed, they also did lead to small shifts. And so I'm suggesting that this attempt to drive that transformation, even if one doesn't produce an outcome that looks like something like a utopian outcome, nevertheless has the potential of shifting the disposition. And so that's a risky game, yeah? That's not something knowing, but it's playing on the ambivalence and undecidability of the structure, as opposed to assuming that one can too easily dismantle it. And so from my perspective, and this is what I'm trying to suggest, that the co-optation, depending on the strategy used, can potentially realign the system. They can also go horribly wrong and operate in the other direction, as we also know, tragically in other conditions. But that, I'm talking about the sort of ethics of engaging in that instability and asking whether, knowing that the system will co-opt, it will recognize value in something once considered illegal and normalize it, doesn't have some type of strategic value. And there are very cynical examples. Something else I've endlessly fascinated by is the way in which the World Bank, which initially refused or tried to imagine slum clearance projects in many parts of the so-called developing world, later recognized the incredible value of informal settlements to multinational corporations wanting to come in and find cheap labor pools, near urban. So these, that's another. These sorts of ambivalences where the system of power recognizes something that was once deemed illegal, and I'm trying to think about how to engage that dynamic. How to think with that dynamic, understanding its risks, but.
No, I don't want to steal other people's chance. Just to say, maybe there's also an aspect here of, the system, if you like, the government or capitalism.
I know that's very old-fashioned language, but I am,
responding to critique. The question of responding to critique, but by its own terms. Okay.
Thank you so much. I haven't read that Banham paper, but it struck me that it parallels very closely some things in the Los Angeles book. And there he sort of idealizes surfboard makers, hot rodders, all those kinds of things as people who, as he puts it, innocently are breaking the rules around technology. And there's no suggestion that they have a political agenda to it. Now, obviously, the book was Southern California, this is Northern California, and he definitely had his bias for the South, but is there an element of sort of material process in something like Project One that can be maybe recuperated outside of its somewhat naive politics?
To answer that question, in a way, I don't know that this is the right way to go, but I would think in terms of the individual groups that were working, within spaces, often collectively, and that were indeed quite interesting, like Optic Nerve, the video collective, that's famous for videos on the Miss America pageant and things like that, often conceived as early feminist video collective. That was not entirely, they're more interested in Americana, but so lots of things came, musicians came out of, I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but yes, it did sponsor some artistic and political practices, but again, the question of like, on the one hand, there are accounts of like the FBI setting up, across the street to watch them, but there's also this internal surveillance going on, and so I'm also that's the question. Like, it's not just the naivety of the politics, it's the system of information extraction that's going on around these practices that's also part of the machinery of the commune. Yeah, this is, so I'd say yes, one could redeem individual practices, so to speak, and I haven't done enough work. I'd love to know more about the hologram school, I have to say, but you know, there's, yeah, I'm sure there is all sorts of ways of doing that, absolutely.
So we have time for one more question.
To what extent is I guess that's a follow-up on the previous question.
Yeah.
To what extent is the technology culprit in turning what is counter into alternative? As opposed to the other systems, I'm just trying to discern or disentangle that from this. There's a term that I'm not sure even what discipline that is, besides new media and so on, but there's the term of affordances, the new affordances of new technologies that suggest that they actually are not that predictable, and they're not always extractive in the same way that I feel you're suggesting, but I could be just misunderstanding. So again, the question is, to what extent is the technology culprit?
Is the technology, what was the last?
Culprit.
The culprit, yeah. That's a really complicated thing to answer, and I say this because you know, I would want to say that we can, you know, put our computers to work to other ends, but we simultaneously need to acknowledge that you know, their origin story is in war, and you know, and so it's not that the technology is a culprit, but that one needs to pay attention to the types of forces that drive this type of technological development, you know, certainly in the U.S., and ask how to, you know, how to think within that. Not so you know, how not to be too naive about that. So, but I'm not like a Luddite and think we should throw. It's not my point at all. But in terms of the relationship of the technology, in a way, what I was trying to play with, and I realize this is a bit subtle in a spoken presentation, is so if Resource One consider themselves an alternative computer resource center, you know, Brand will try and revalence that as a counter computer, yeah. And so I'm also trying to you know, think about these rhetorical slippages. So I think they would be, yeah, I mean, you're right to say many other ways to write the forms of productivity of the computer outside, you know, Brand's particular attempt to revalence these practices and mobilize them to his own ends, and that would be one way of refusing a sort of essentialist reading of the computer. But I'm not trying to situate the computer as somehow a piece of technological evil or something like that. I'm trying to ask, you know, so even in the shift from a sort of community operation to the recognition that this could be a, you know, regional database collection, you know, so that's a shift, and same technology is being put to work, but with very different directives and understanding of information flow. So it's not the technology itself, yeah. I mean, I think the technology is totally ambivalent, but the ways in which it's inscribed, yeah, within these different types of political claims, which are political agendas. And does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely it does.
Yeah.
I wasn't asking with an accusative or.
Oh, I wasn't feeling accusatory. I was trying to.
I wasn't implying. I'm actually not sure myself whether
Yeah.
it is or not, because even the terminology of affordances currently comes from what was a technological determinism, but becomes the independent agency of digital technologies. It's not just Hansen, it's Hales and others. But yeah, it's just I'm trying to discern a way through that. But thank you.
To think somewhere else, yeah. It's a good question.
So thank you, Felicity. Thanks to all of you again. So please join us for the reception and exhibition opening and the